Hey there, I'm Whitney Webb, contributing editor to Unlimited Hangout, here today with Mark Goodwin.
I'm Mark Goodwin. I'm the editor-in-chief of Bitcoin Magazine and the author of the Bitcoin Dollar.
And today Mark and I are going to be talking about debt in the digital finance era, digital debt, I guess you could say. So to start off, we wanted to talk about the new international monetary system that's taking shape. So some of the people that we've written about recently and also over the past few years have announced on and off that we're in the new Bretton Woods moment, that this moment needs to be seized to create a new global financial governance system. And if you believe people like Mark Carney, one of the most prominent central bankers in the world and the current UN envoy for climate finance, the pillars of this, the three pillars of this new financial system to be created are multipolar currencies, global carbon markets, and CBDCs and their private sector equivalents. So I guess we'll start with one of these pillars, one that you and I have been talking and writing a lot about over the past, few years or so. I guess it would be CBDCs and the private sector equivalent. So, Mark, you want to give an overview maybe of where that's going and how it's not just, retail CBDC. We need to be vigilant about wholesale CBDC as well, and how this facilitates this new financial governance system.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of fear about direct issued government digital currencies. The fears being that it increases the ability for surveillance and the ability for blacklisting, and this programmability, of digital money can be used against citizens from big bad evil government, which of course is true, but capital creation has really never been a public sector. It hasn't been a public sector gambit for a really long time. It's really been taken over by the private sector, and the way that works is the government issues these securities and sells these bonds to private banks, who then use those bonds to create dollars. They use the collateral from the debt that they buy from the government to actually create the dollars in your bank account. The digital dollar has been around for a very long time. It's been digitized for decades. And so we have this, big fear that's been basically, simulated of digital, direct issued digital currency from the government. And we're all very fearful of that. But really what's happening, what we're actually seeing, much more so than CBDCs actually being issued, is we're seeing the private sector enter the market and continue this game of private capital creation by buying these bonds and creating these, debt tokens, basically. And that's what stable coins are. They're tokenized debt with a dollar denomination. And we're going to continue to see that. The private sector actually is very helpful for the government. We can look at COVID as this kind of model for what they're going to do, where they used, private companies to restrict certain voices, restrict certain ideas, blacklist certain discourse from the discussion about COVID. Whereas if these were actually public squares that the government needed to uphold for citizens, they would not really be able to restrict people as much. But they can go ahead and force these sort of private companies that are heavily government contracted, like a Google or a Twitter, to suppress voices. They're going to do the same thing with the banking industry, and they're going to be private basically in name only, have very heavy connections with these private, fintech companies that are issuing stablecoins. And we've already seen that. Tether already has onboarded the FBI and the Secret Service, to their blockchain. Meanwhile, they're buying $100 billion worth of government debt. And one of the fastest growing sectors of purchasing government debt are these fintech companies. So I think the CBDC thing is really going to be basically essentially a red herring, and we're going to see the private capital creation gambit continue. There was $100 billion worth of treasuries purchased by Tether and its subsidiaries, and the people that own them, like Cantor Fitzgerald, Deltec, these banking partners. They're one of the fastest growing markets for government debt purchasing. They would be in the top 20 of a sovereign nation buying debt. They're at about 1/10 of our biggest creditor, which is China and Japan. They're just a little bit above $1 trillion. They're now at $100 billion. So just one company has 1/10 of the debt that the U.S. has ever sold to China and Japan.
Do you think the U.S. Government's runaway spending and extreme behavior with respect to the amount of debt they're accruing is going to be the way they're going to try and manage that is going to involve stable coins then?
I absolutely do. Yeah, I mean, they have to sell this debt to somebody, right? We're now at this kind of unique place where the debt service, just to service our debt, not to pay it off, but just the service of the interest on the debt, is now outpacing in a year the growth of the GDP. So we're essentially, if you look at the U.S. as a corporation, and in many ways it is, we're a zombie corporation. You would never invest in us, never. Our debt is outpacing our growth. And so they have to find somewhere to sell this debt to. It's been Japan and China and, the Bahamas basically, for the history of the U.S. selling debt. And now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're seeing these private entity stablecoin providers just Pac-manning up government debt and just eating it up. And that's not going to stop. We've heard from, Walter Hessert, who's the head of strategy at Paxos, which is very integrated with PayPal. They run their PayPal stablecoin. And he's specifically said that we're going to see, trillions of dollars of stablecoins, highly regulated stablecoins issued. The only way that happens is if trillions of dollars of government debt are purchased.
So a recent report came out discussing how most of the stable coins in the world in terms of adoption outside the U.S. is happening in Latin America, specifically in Argentina, leading the pack because of the financial instability there. So how do you view that in the context of the fact that the U.S. historically has used debt through the World Bank and some of the IMF, some of these institutions using debt to control these countries? Do you think stable coins could take the charge there?
I think stable coins are the ultimate technology for spreading U.S. government debt around the world. And they're using this really clever and diabolical framing of, hey, no, we're these countries like Argentina, they've been wrecked by inflation and their really bad currency is the issue. It's their bad currency, their fiat, bad governance, monetary policy. So we're doing a huge favor by giving them access to US, dollar denominated, essentially bank accounts. We're banking the unbanked. But no, really what you're doing is you're charging the global south a fee to use your bank account. And in a lot of these cases, these are offshore Bahamian bank accounts. Some of them are, they're now getting more regulated within the purview of the DOJ and the SEC and the CFTC and, the Fed Treasury. But, historically, these have been basically offshore banks. And we're going to see high velocity of dollar usage, high volume of dollar usage. And we're going to see more and more countries relying on the dollar, and we're seeing that in South America, as you stated, and in the global south, and on the whole, and in parts of Asia, huge upticks of stablecoin usage, of dollar usage, and it's being framed as this humanitarian effort, wherein really it's debt serfdom.
Debt serfdom. So, of course, one of the main concerns voiced among critics of CBDCs is programmability and surveillability. What's the potential for those things to be implemented in these stable coins that are onto which all these people in Latin America are being onboarded?
Totally, 100%. There is no difference between the programmability of a private entity stablecoin versus a direct issued government one. In fact, there's actually probably more ability for a private entity stablecoin to do, there's probably more opportunity for a private entity stablecoin to do more shenanigans with the programmability of their dollar-denominated token rather than the government. Again, they can hide behind, the restriction of customer access being in the private sector. They retain a lot more ability to do that than they would if they were openly in the public sector. We've seen this happen before. We've seen multiple times in the last few years, banks restrict people for saying certain things online or being, around the Capitol building on a certain day or, protesting mandates, say in North America and in Canada and taking away banker restrictions or rights to your bank account. So we've seen the private sector, the private banking sector already flex these restrictions for being private entities. That it will only be more accessible for them with programmability. They could take your money away, blacklist your money. We've seen this already with the FBI and the Secret Service coming on to Tether. They've blacklisted dozens of addresses at the behest of the regulatory arm of the United States. That is a power that will not be given up. It's too important as a tool. And so as they, with one hand, are pushing this as this financial tool to give sovereignty to the global South, at the same time they're onboarding literally U.S. intelligence and law enforcement onto that very system that is a very transparent and surveillable, programmable system. So you can kind of see the dialectic there, the rhetoric versus the action.
So the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, issued a document, I think a couple years ago, talking about how the wholesale CBDC model was appearing to emerge as the preferred model of CBDC as opposed to retail CBDC. So how would these stable coins or some of their other, other things like deposit tokens figure into the wholesale CBDC system? Can you sort of explain for people that aren't aware of the two-tier CBDC concept, sort of what that architecture would be and why you are critical of it?
Sure. Yeah, the two-tier model for capital creation, people look at, I think people are now more aware of the fact that there's a two-tier model because they're looking at the digitalizing of the U.S. dollar system or really the financial system. But it's always been a two-tier model. It's sort of a misnomer that the dollar is the world reserve. They say currency, which it's the world reserve currency, but it's backed by the world reserve asset, which is U.S. treasuries. And that's always been the case. The U.S. government, prints very little of actual, dollars or coins or any sort of kind of M0. Really, it's these massive amounts of debt that they create in these T-bills, these treasury bonds that then they sell to private banks to finance the U.S. budget to then create the currency that we all use. So it's always been a two-tiered system. And that's sort of how this gambit works. And the digital version of that will be exactly the same. So while there may be retail-facing CBDCs in some places of the world, maybe in China or in the UAE, there's a possibility for the government to actually be involved directly in the creation of a retail-facing. Much more likely, we're going to see that be taken by the private sector, and the government actually issuing these deposit tokens that act in the same way that U.S. treasuries work as the backing to the retail-facing CBDC. So there's currency and assets that back the currency. That's always been the two-tier model. So now we're seeing private companies, creating the technology for these banks to do interbank settlement of securities. And that's actually what we saw with FedNow that was launched last year within the U.S. It was just an updating of the treasury settlement within the United States. It wasn't a CBDC in any way. There was no token created. There's no retail-facing product. There's no accounts at all. It really was just modernized rails for banks within the Federal Reserve System to settle treasuries. So that is always the case. That will be the case. We're just going to see a new version of it that increases the ability of settlement and auditability. The main issue with the U.S. dollar system is the lack of transparency. It's the obfuscation of, where this collateral actually is, where these assets actually are that get misplaced. Bad things seem to happen when trillions of dollars go missing and we don't know why. So they're going to digitize it and create this two-tiered system that then they can use these deposit tokens to create currency on top of and fractionalize these tokens and use them and cut them all up and do their debt games that they love to do, that we've seen the likes of Larry Fink creating the CMO and watching what happened in 2008 with the CBO explosion. We're going to continue to see that, and the two-tier model will enable that at a much higher velocity than we've ever seen before.
So for the past several centuries, the world has pretty much been operating under a debt-based monetary system. And debt has been used to control people, large groups, entire countries, groups of countries for a very long time. So how do you see the use of debt as a form of control changing in this new age where it can be programmed, essentially, like programmable debt?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the same mechanism, the same two-tier system, the same people that get to sit around around the money printer that get to create the debt that they sell to people. It's the same people. They want to uphold this model. They just want to do it in a way that allows them to do it better. Stable coins, much like dollars, are debt. They're debt instruments. This entire system is based on debt, as you just said. And so they want to digitize debt. And the way that you do that is you have to have it with some, connected to some sort of collateral, some sort of asset somewhere that you actually use to create the credit on top of. So I don't think it's a surprise that we're seeing people trying, their darndest to figure out how do we digitize debt? How do we digitize deposit tokens? How do we digitize securities? How do we digitize, the dollar instrument, the token of the dollar is the easiest part. How do we digitize these instruments that we use to, create debt with, like real estate or natural assets or all these things. So we're seeing this push now as the technology is getting better and more of these huge institutional debt players, like a BlackRock or a JP Morgan, are moving into blockchain. There's an entire new push to digitize the natural world, real estate, and these treasury security debt model, assets, to be able to put them into a universal ledger that then can be used to create credit on top of. So yeah, we're going to see a digitalization of debt. And I think the thing that's really interesting about the digitalization of debt is we're seeing this happen at the same time as the rise of Bitcoin, which is essentially the only digital asset that isn't debt. It's digital M0. It operates in the same way that the treasury operates, in that instead of relying on a trusted third party to settle, or there being an account balance like an M1, like a checkings account, it's if you hold the coins and you hold the ability to sign for those coins, no one can stop you from settling them or trading them. And this is digital credit or digital M0. And that's a total phase change from anything we've ever seen via PayPal or Venmo or Zelle or any of the digital dollars in your Bank of America, Wells Fargo, whatever. Any digital dollar we've seen before, digital asset, has always been debt-based. And now we're seeing the introduction of digital M0. And I don't think it's an accident that it's happening at the same time. If you want to digitize debt, you also need to digitize credit. And so we're seeing the rise simultaneously.
Well, as far as the programmability goes, I personally feel like that one of the reasons they feel like they need that is because it allows them to micromanage how people use their money to an unprecedented degree. And then it also essentially I'm pretty sure would allow them to essentially automate that micromanagement. Do you agree with that? And is there anything else that you think that programmability affords the people that control this debt-based system?
Well, yeah, it lets them be able to set basically the funding rate of money, the yields, the interest rates of overnight lending, of yearly interest rates on bonds. It gives them much more control over this system, 365, 24/7. Blockchains don't sleep; they always go. But I do think you kind of hinted on it there, and I'd love to hear your take on okay, well, if we're digitizing everything, we're giving everything a number, everything an integer on this ledger. How do humans interact with it? What is the necessary piece for humans to be able to interact with this universal ledger? You've written a lot about how digital ID systems work and how it's a necessity for this digitized system. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about how you think digital IDs are one of maybe a sub-pillar of the Carney model for the pillars of the financial system.
Well, I would say in this context, I think the digital ID is a key enabler of the surveillance, knowing what everyone is doing at the transactional level and being able to tweak that micromanagement based on a person's activity, because the digital ID isn't just limited to the financial system, right? It's like your travel, your health history, your career history, your education credentials, your access to telecommunications, social media, the internet. With the new AI era, right, they can fuse all that data, analyze it, and depending on how they develop that AI algorithm, use it to control people really in unprecedented ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you see is this whole digital debt model even possible without digital IDs? Who's really been working on these projects? Is this something that's embraced by the people that are trying to build this system, or is this sort of like just a necessity that needs to be done?
Well, I think the digital ID and the CBDC and its private sector equivalence project is something that we're always sort of intended to be the same system. So there's documents from the UN, from the BIS, and related groups that are sort of that have been working on this for years, that essentially frame one as essential to the other, using words about, this is inclusionary, the whole, I guess, marketing behind digital ID is that everyone needs a legal ID because otherwise they're unable to access essential services, right? And so the idea is we all have to be included in the system, and they directly link that to the concept of financial inclusion and banking the unbanked, which you brought up earlier. But inherently, these systems actually function in an exclusionary way, based on how they've been set up. They have essentially said that this will be the only way to prove you have legal identity. And so if you don't participate in that system, as far as the state or the private sector is concerned, you don't exist. So by not participating in that system, you're inherently excluded from the economic system and really essentially everything. So you have to onboard to the surveillance state or be excluded from everything. So it's, being marketed as inclusion, but it's really inherently exclusionary.
Totally. So how does this system get triggered? How do we move into the Mark Carney-ism? How does this actually happen? Obviously, if everyone zooms out and looks at this whole system and sees this panopticon that's being created, and the digitization and tokenization and fractionalization of everything and everyone, obviously we're not going to just like march into that knowing, that's the end goal. So
Sure.
how does this event get triggered? Is there an event? Is it a convenience thing? Is it, how do we end up where they want us to go?
Well, I think they sort of give it away when they say that this is the new Bretton Woods movement that needs to be seized. So Bretton Woods was what came out of World War II, essentially, and was the creation of a new financial governance system after World War II. And this is essentially an effort to create a new financial governance system that was announced well before any sort of crisis like that, but it's probably going to need a crisis of that level to be implemented and to convince people to onboard at scale. And if you subscribe to the theory that all wars are bankers' wars, which there is plenty of evidence to support that, I would say, that seems to suggest that perhaps, this is the it's going to be a problem reaction solution type of situation where they've already made the solution. They've already developed what they want to be the new financial governance system after this new Bretton Woods moment. They just need some sort of big event on the scale of World War II or some large event that's, equally disruptive in order to be like, all right, now it's time for a new financial governance system after this big event like they did after World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the thing that's so interesting about this debt bubble exploding is that when you know that the debt bubble is going to explode and you want to explode it into the new system, the way that you sort of trigger that into the system that you want to get the masses to go with you is you actually want to have the most debt obligations on the record, on the board, so that when the system pops, they'll all pop. When the debt bubble pops, every debt bubble will pop. It will be everything all at once. It won't just be like, oh, Japan's fine, the US is fucked. It won't work like that. Everything will pop at once. So in this weird way, you actually want to create as much debt as possible right before the pin bursts the bubble, and then you can offer this, hey, we'll service your debt 1-to-1 if you come join this new universal tokenized ledger. Just sign up here, do a selfie of your face and give us your biometrics, and then here you are. So do you see that? Do you think that the COVID stimulus and monetary expansion was essentially a hey, this is the U.S. dollar system understanding that the global debt, this system post Bretton Woods is about to explode, so let's create as much debt as possible to then lead everybody into the new system? Are these players that are building the new system the same people that blew out the debt before?
Yeah, I think there's a correlation there. A lot of the people building this system are people that are debt barons, essentially. BlackRock in particular had a really big role to play in the whole COVID monetary situation. At the same 2019 Jackson Hole meeting where Mark Carney talked about the new financial system to come is when BlackRock presented their going direct paper, which was the policy that was followed essentially and exactly when COVID hit, just a few months later. And BlackRock utilizes debt to increase its profitability and power and ownership of things around the world. And honestly, since debt's been such a big part of the control system for a long time, it's the people that can control the most debt on Wall Street and stuff tend to be the most powerful and the most successful, right? So
yeah, totally. And these people are very you talk about BlackRock, obviously led by Larry Fink. And you look at, how close he's been to the public sector, over the years. I mean, called almost 40 times in 2011 as they're, dealing with the debt ceiling limit, under Obama. He literally banked Donald Trump before he was the president. And then, is a crucial part of, the bailout distribution and the whole play for, how they did the monetary expansion under COVID. Now, are you seeing these same players? How are you seeing BlackRock preparing itself for the token future? Are you seeing them, move into infrastructure? Are you seeing them move into, carbon markets? And what exactly are you seeing? How are these known debt barons preparing to retain debt baron status as the world and debt goes digital?
Well, it seems like in Larry Fink's case in particular, there's a goal, a big ambition there to develop new asset classes that can be used to basically fuel their existing business model and perpetuate it for millennia forward. Mm-hmm. So one of these that I've been writing about for a few years is the whole idea of natural assets, what they call nature's economy. And one of the groups that has been sort of propelling this forward, at least one of the earlier groups, the Intrinsic Exchange Group, which is a product of the Rockefeller Foundation and the multilateral development banking system, has a graphic on their website called The Opportunity, and they show there the existing amount of assets in the world economy, and then show what it, if we unlock natural assets, how nature's economy, it's like 6 times the amount of existing assets in the economy today. And so as an asset manager, BlackRock being able to unlock and take control of as many natural assets as possible that aren't currently part of the financial system is obviously a way for them to perpetuate what they do and deepen and expand their control over not just people in the existing financial system, but really over the natural world as well, and essentially turn everything alive into a tradable Wall Street financial product. And the goal, as Fink has stated, is to have all of this on a universal ledger, on blockchain presumably, and have it be trackable and surveillable, which is interesting if you look at it through the context of risk management, which is something that Larry Fink is very open as having been one of the guiding lights of his whole career. And so by having it all surveillable and automated in a sense, he's able to have his risk management AI thing, Aladdin, sort of exercise control over it in unprecedented ways, I think, for their benefit. And then, of course, a lot of what's happening now as we're moving into this new financial governance system is the push to change all of the infrastructure towards this, quote unquote, green a green model, I guess, or decarbonization, right? Which is, of course, interface with the global carbon market, but not necessarily so, like it doesn't have to be. But the push is obviously to create a bunch of new infrastructure all over the world, and BlackRock is positioning themselves to be one of the key players in that space. They acquired, I think they're called GIP, one of the biggest infrastructure, developers in the world. And I think one of their top guys at Davos just a few months ago was talking about how they're betting really big on infrastructure going forward, and it's going to be one of the biggest investment opportunities of the next several decades, actually. So I think they're quite ambitious, and if people aren't aware of this, I'm sure they'll get away with it, but we'll see.
Yeah, so basically they want to use our retirement money to gamble on the privatization of energy and infrastructure of the global south.
Well, they want to build the infrastructure both for the carbon markets and for the decarbonized world. They're using retirement assets of Americans, pension funds, and all of that to finance the constructing of what is essentially our debt-based panopticon.
Right. Mm-hmm. So say they want, and I think all of that is obviously true, and we've written about that. If they want to digitize and tokenize and fractionalize, the natural world, which is essentially stated that that's what they want to do. Mm-hmm. What are the difficulties of that? I see, someone who's kind of studied, the way blockchains basically interact with real world data and price feeds, is there's sort of this issue, basically kind of colloquially known as like the Oracle problem of like, how do you actually put a proper price feed into a decentralized, smart contract, right? Like if say you want to, gamble on something on the game or whatever, and, you want it to pay out when the game's over, how do you implement, who scored the most points? You have to have this trusted source of a real world data point to actually then interact into this universal ledger smart contract system. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing basically a development within the private sector of how do we offer this as a service and like trust us, we're the trusted oracles that will tell you that your gold bar exists in this bank vault, mm-hmm. and that it is one-to-one represented, to your asset on the blockchain. Are you seeing any sort of mechanisms or investment in certain types of companies that would allow basically a trusted Oracle service like this to be able to say your tree is here, or your rainforest square mileage is here, or your piece of gold is here? Are you seeing anything like that will help that?
Yeah, there's a few companies that I mentioned in the tokenized ink piece that are sort of trying to position themselves that way. So you have, in the case of global carbon markets or the infrastructure for it, you have a company like Flow Carbon that's like tokenizing the assets, and they're tokenizing carbon credits that are produced by another high integrity carbon credit standardization company. One of these, there's a couple different names for them. I think there's like 5 prominent ones, and then those are the ones, between the two of them, that's how they claim to verify all these reserves, to avoid some of the scandals of carbon markets when they attempted to launch them in the past, of double counting, or the offsets weren't really real, or they were giving carbon credits for forests that they said were being saved from logging, but they were never in danger to begin with. And some of these controversies they're trying to get around with, claiming that, not unlike Fink does, the idea that like having it on blockchain magically is going to eliminate corruption.
Right, eliminates corruption.
Which is funny, because I think the way that they're able to perpetuate their corruption that they've been able to get away with in these ostensibly highly regulated markets we already have, I think the way they're going to do it in this model is through these trusted third parties. Just the trust us guys, they'll be able to manage our stuff, the surf stuff, and not let us get away with anything probably, but the big guys at the top, I'm sure, will be able to manipulate those trusted third parties. And in a lot of the cases, of like Oracle companies that act as those oracles, like a Chainlink, I guess, you have prominent major big tech oligarchs like Eric Schmidt being intimately involved with their rise. And will they be beholden to those oligarchs at some point if they're like, we need you to do this and that? Right. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely happened in the past, so why wouldn't it happen in the new era? I mean, would blockchain prevent that? I mean, not necessarily.
Right. You talk about high integrity. Who's the founder of Carbon Flow?
Oh, Flow Carbon? It's Adam Newman of WeWork. But they use the term high integrity because that's how they're trying to rebrand it after some of the mistakes of the past that garnered carbon markets in general a bad name.
Totally. And I think that's really interesting too, because Larry Fink did literally say that the tokenization and blockchain eliminates all potential for corruption, which is really absurd when you consider that some of the closest partners to BlackRock, like JP Morgan and Bank of America, have two of the largest fines ever in the history of the United States for literal market manipulation,
Sure.
treasury spoofing, precious market spoofing, and then their, criminal activity in the 2007, 8, 09, debt implosion, specifically Bank of America, was like almost $17 billion. This idea that blockchain just magically eliminates corruption is really absurd, and I think it runs into this idea of decentralization theater, basically, and how these companies are hiding behind these isms and ideologies of the blockchain, that it's this magical thing. And I think there's something important there that if you control basically these third party systems, like an Oracle system within an interoperable, CBDC model, a multipolarity currency model, that's all these different jurisdictions that are all connected. That connecting, mycelium basically between all of these different pods, then that becomes the trusted third party. It doesn't matter if me and you sending, currency to each other is through this trustless blockchain, if then the thing that exchanges the assets that actually are represented on the ledger, then it's just it's even more centralized.
Well, I think it's likely too that either the national governments or the UN or somebody like that is going to choose who the trusted third parties are. They're going to be the kingmakers of who gets to serve in that role. And so they're able to choose the ones that are most compliant to their needs, or the ones that they created in the first place to serve the specific purpose and things of that nature. But to think that the fact that a lot of these corrupt entities that we know are corrupt or have engaged in corruption, BlackRock, JP Morgan, et cetera, are some of the key architects of the system, to think that they would all of a sudden not engage in that activity when they're the ones building this system. It's not like they're going to build a new system that ties their hands back, They're going to be able to engage in business as usual. And I think part of the goal of the whole global carbon market thing for them is that it allows them to unlock so many new assets and so much more collateral and so much other stuff to create new debt out of, and to just sort of expand the existing models they use to just unprecedented levels, and sort of perpetuate this into infinity. I don't know. I mean, it's just really crazy to think about, but I think honestly, the reason they haven't abandoned the global carbon market is because they need that new asset class that's so enormous. Because one of the things too about the natural asset thing, at least as far as the natural asset corporation model is concerned, is that you literally just go into a forest or you go to a river or lake and you identify the natural asset, and then at no cost to you, just after identifying it, you issue shares in the natural asset, a lake, a forest, whatever, and then you sell those shares to sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, whatever, and then you have an IPO and generate all this money. I mean, it's literally just pointing out something outside and being like, this is mine, I'm going to fractionalize it and sell it to people, and you're producing money in out of thin air, essentially. Yeah. And you're able to do that. I mean, the natural world is vast and huge, and they're doing this, they're financializing it all, as framing it as the only way to save the planet. Right. But really it's the only way for them to save their insane debt racket.
Right. And it's funny too, because I think there's a parallel here that you've talked a lot about, where it's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain playing with the blockchains and who's validating the blockchains. Yeah. Howie Lutnick of Cantor, specifically said, hey, if you want something seized, Tether's great, you just call Tether. Ethereum's great, you just call Joe Lubin. You call the guy behind the decentralized theater to blacklist the person or do whatever. Mm-hmm. Reminds me kind of a little bit of how the AI play is probably going to go, right? It's like, oh, it's AI that's in charge. It's AI that's in control of all these things, but really it's the keepers of the AI.
Totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you have to pay attention to the people that are tweaking the AI, programming its objective functions that maintain it. They're able to manipulate it, and there is definitely a coordinated push to put AI in charge of as much of everything really as possible, and allows them to sort of follow what I call the Wizard of Oz model, be the man behind the curtain, but have AI be sort of this layer between you and the public that gives you sort of allows you to never be accountable for anything. You can just either blame everything on on the AI, or say like AI is superior to human intelligence and therefore, it's not our fault and we should trust what it says. Computer says yes, computer says no. And, I think it's very likely that AI, following that same model, is going to have a very big role in this coming, digital financial system.
Yeah. There's digital debt and there's digital data. And blockchain is useless without digital debt, and AI is useless without digital data. So they're basically trying to create, well, how do we feed the real world into these two systems, and then how do we fuse these two systems while actually really having a guy sitting there on the computer that's pressing all the buttons?
Yeah, so, this universal ledger that Larry Fink's talking about is going to be the debt data system, basically.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and it's so strange too, because I think a lot of the fear of CBDCs and all that, there's this like, everything's going to be surveilled, and the blacklist opportunities and all these things. It's like, how could it be any worse than it is now? How could the panopticon be any worse? Well, the way that you make it worse is you make the ledger that upholds it immutable and durable and upheld by everyone in the system, as a this is convenient for you. This is the free market. You're a sovereign individual by running your own node and holding on to this data for everybody and upholding this ledger and connecting to peers and, validating, So I'm seeing this, this typically, this socialism model, this world government model, this carbon market model has typically been sort of a lefty comment, like a liberal modern movement.
To leftists.
Right. Yeah. But now we're seeing a new thing kind of happening in this, kind of post-Trump like phase shift basically to the right, and using the right in this sort of anarchistic, capitalist, libertarian model that, how do you actually enact a carbon market, blockchains, digital IDs? How do we actually, ransack the global south via carbon market control and tokenize the rainforest? Yeah. It's like, well, we do it as...
Yeah, well, I think the selling point that we're going to be seeing soon are these same guys saying this is the free market solution to climate change.
Right.
Let's let the free market resolve the environmental issues that we're facing, and this is the way to do it. I think it's probably going to be cloaked under those metrics, because obviously framing it in sort of a left-leaning way has been unsuccessful and generated a lot of pushback. To the point where you have big groups like BlackRock and Vanguard, abandoning some big climate groups that they were a part of. You have Larry Fink openly backing away from the term ESG after being sort of the ESG champion guy, and going on record saying that a lot of this stuff that BlackRock's been involved in, that's been framed as ESG, isn't about politics or ideology. It's about the prospect of long-term returns and profit. So I think, him moving in that rhetorical direction is sort of a harbinger of what we're likely to see going forward, because they want the big players in financial markets to sign on, and they don't want to see it as like a state-led thing. They want to see it as a private sector-led thing to get them to onboard, and also to sort of, I think, neuter a lot of the criticism from right-leaning people and the populist right in general.
The guys with guns.
Yeah, well, in the States,
Sure.
the majority of gun owners, right? They want to sort of placate them, and I think they're also going to offer it to people as, if you buy into these systems, you'll, be prosperous. This is, a return to sovereignty and prosperity, right. And they're going to use some of these technologies, where people have heard the terms but aren't necessarily overly familiar with them, and sort of market it as being, a return to financial sovereignty and prosperity and stuff, but not necessarily. I think it's, again, it's going to be the same debt-based monetary system. Debt is a form of control,
right?
But they're going to try and market it, I think, under those metrics.
Yeah, it's really disturbing when you think about it, like the mechanism. They basically privatized the profiteering off the debt bubble, and now that the debt bubble was out of control and it's going to do its thing, it's like, well, now let's make it public, and now let's give everyone access to the debt market as everything is about to explode. It's like there was like, a dozen banks around the money printer basically when we printed 90% of all US dollars in the last like 5 years or whatever. It's like there was such a small amount of people that benefited off of that, and now that we're in this new paradigm of $34 trillion and growing every day, it's like, oh, now we want to actually make the debt market open to everybody. And
yeah. So I feel like we've talked about two of the pillars that we sort of started off the discussion with of this new financial system and carbon markets, CBDCs and their private sector equivalents. The one thing we haven't really talked about is Carney's prediction that there was going to be sort of multipolar reserve currencies. And earlier in our discussion, you talked about the U.S. Dollar, not necessarily, it is the reserve currency, but it's only that because, it's backed by the reserve asset. Right, U.S. Treasury. So I guess if Mark Carney's talking about this multipolar currency paradigm, that presumably is also going to be multipolar reserve assets, or rather, it's not necessarily going to be Treasury dominated anymore. The reverse, asset landscape, reserve asset landscape. It's going to be more than just treasuries. So what do you think is likely to happen there?
Well, I still think treasuries are going to dominate, for sure. But I think, there will be kind of like a false victory of like, oh, well, now this, jurisdiction can print their own security tokens and issue their own currency. Retail, I think is going to be, we're going to see dozens or hundreds maybe even of currencies, whether they're private entity, funny little alternative cryptocurrencies, or, state, like euro pegged, stable coins, or, e-naira or e-yuan, or, we'll see, national currencies be digitized. But I still think it's a little bit of it's kind of a trick of kind of the Mark Carneys of the world, where there's this idea that it becomes multipolar, and it becomes multipolar basically in face only. But really, they're trying to create as much dollar-denominated debt as possible. You want to create as much dollar liabilities as possible for when the debt bubble explodes. So that's the first thing, is we're creating as much dollar debt as possible. And then you basically give people the ability to create money as this victory. And so people will begin to issue things. We're already seeing that. But there will be the interoperability system, as we kind of talked about, that connects all of these systems. So what is there's a new sovereign digital currency that has its own reserve asset, but then they want to trade and be able to, play in the US market. They're going to have some sort of interoperable reserve asset that can be exchanged and traded with the US system to do foreign exchange, to do imports and exports. So whoever is that controlling thing, in the same way, the US empire, so much of it is based upon controlling the seas and controlling trade. And yes, currency manipulation is a huge part of it, but there's a huge element of literal control over the trade routes. That same thing is going to occur, but in the digital debt world, in this multipolarity interoperability. So whoever wins basically the seas of trade between all of these little poles everywhere is going to be the big winner. So they basically push this idea that it's this this new paradigm for the nation state to come back and de-dollarize the BRICS model, all these things. We're cheering on de-dollarization, but really it's kind of a psyop, as the world is the most dollarized it's ever been, and we're seeing dollar-denominated liabilities spread all across the world.
Well, since Carney made this claim, there's been, in some of the most establishment financial, mainstream media organizations, claims about how this multipolar currency paradigm is taking shape. And, in Carney's speech, and also some of these outlets initially were sort of pointing towards the yuan as being some sort of competitor there. But now it looks like they've sort of moved towards what the efforts of the BRICS bloc collectively to make a BRICS currency.
Right.
Have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that in general, the idea of multipolarity in the geopolitical spectrum is, again, kind of it's a useful way to create left, right, us versus them, red, blue, these paradigms that they use as a way to basically control us with dialectics. and get us towards the output. It's
Sure.
not red versus blue, it's purple versus you kind of thing.
The BRICS countries are all very committed to UN Agenda 2030 and the
Right.
SDGs and all of that. And Mark Carney, one of the architects of this, is the UN envoy for climate finance that's designing a key part of the financial aspect.
Right.
He's basically in charge of implementing the financial aspects of the SDGs, and BRICS countries are just as committed to that as those in the West.
Was there any tangible difference between the BRICS era response to COVID as there was to the U.S., UN, NATO response to COVID? Was there any difference between the Ukraine and Russia's response to COVID? Just a couple years before? No, there really wasn't. It was a lockstep. I think if you really believe this idea of multipolarity after what we saw in 2020, where we saw the same corporations basically, or at least 4 or 5 of corporations get to vaccinate everybody in the world, there was a lockstep lockdown, everyone went to zero interest rates, everyone printed a large percentage of money. I mean, there was basically no one that didn't do that. Or certainly anyone in kind of these meaningful discussions of who's going to take over new economic hegemon. So I see the same thing happening with this multipolarity currency system. We're going to see the private sector take over and do the bidding of the people really in charge of the public sector, and we're going to see the same oligarchs basically that ran the COVID response all across the world run the money. Because that's what it's always been. The money has always been the monopoly of world control, and those people are not going to willingly give this up.
So, Fink recently said that he views Bitcoin specifically as a technology for asset storage. And in this multipolar currency paradigm, it's likely there's going to be, in multipolar reserve assets, they want to move away from the appearance, at least, that the U.S. dominates the reserve assets of the world. Do you think Bitcoin has a place in that? And do you think it's possible for the U.S. government to sort of Wizard of Oz that, to sort of be able to manipulate countries, through that potentially?
100%. Yeah. I mean, we talked earlier about how, Bitcoin basically is digital M0. It's this digital base layer money, digital base money, and all of these other dollar denominated things and Ethereums and all these whatevers are debt based. And Larry Fink specifically talks about it's technology for storing assets. It's this universal ledger of the state that we can shove any integers into, any bits, and use it to uphold the state of all sorts of other assets. The U.S. I think has the most to gain from Bitcoin. Actually, it's sort of this weird. It's been framed so much so the opposite. But the U.S. has so much Bitcoin. I mean, we have, I say we liberally, but the United States, has 1 million plus Bitcoin. We're seeing them embrace, 11 spot ETFs since the middle of January. On January 11th, 11 of them were approved by the SEC. The DOJ has seized like 250,000 Bitcoin. We're seeing companies like we're seeing companies like MicroStrategy. Basically doing a speculative attack against the US dollar while their headquarters is 15 minutes away from the CIA at Langley. They have 200,000 Bitcoin. The ETFs, with Grayscale and with the new BlackRock and Fidelity ETFs, there's like almost 600,000 Bitcoin now within the United States. Not to mention the retail wallets and Tesla and all the other, treasuries that exist, Block. There's a huge push within the United States, within the borders of the United States, to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible. This idea that this anti-state, anti-dollar revolution, I think, is sort of not really true based on the actual actions of the United States versus the rhetoric of, say, great example, Trump coming out. He tweets, the Bitcoin is a bunch of hot gas. There's only one reserve currency of the world, and it's the dollar, baby. And then what does he actually do? He brings in the former VP, head legal guy at Coinbase to run the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is like the head legal lawyer, this guy Brian Brooks. He makes it legal for banks to hold crypto assets, to hold stable coins, to hold Bitcoin. Him and Kushner are emailing Mnuchin, talking about the private sector creating like a US dollar coin. So there's this like rhetoric of Bitcoin, Elizabeth Warren, anti-crypto army, all this stuff. It's really bad for the dollar. Same with the Facebook play into cryptocurrency with Libra. The whole Congress just did this whole beautiful Shakespearean act about how it's so dangerous to the US dollar, when in really, it's globalizing. It would globalize the dollar even quicker and destroy all the other currencies in the basket, the Libra model. I think the US has way more to gain as we've crossed this 33 trillion, 34 trillion. We're at this runaway debt service. Where do we print money and retain our economic hegemon? We can actually inflate the dollar into Bitcoin, this demand inelastic asset, and uphold the economic hegemon of the dollar, using Bitcoin basically as this digital M0 to offset. And now we're seeing Basel III laws coming into play with capital requirements, where if you want to hold $100 million of Bitcoin, you need to hold $100 million of dollars on the books as consumer protection. What that actually means is if that $100 million turns into $10 trillion of Bitcoin because of an insane price explosion, now you need to hold $10 trillion. So they've created this tethering, no pun intended, but also probably pun intended, of the dollar system to Bitcoin. They want to control where this debt bubble pops, and now they have the perfect vacuum to suck up the dollar debt.
So, within Bitcoin circles, it's been framed for a long time as the answer to fiat, to the debt-based monetary system. But what you're saying is that the powers that be in the U.S. are poised to use it to perpetuate us into the new era of the debt-based monetary system.
Yes, I am, for sure. But it's not that Bitcoin isn't all the things that we know it is, because it is. That's the thing. It empowers the individual that has gotten hip to it in the first decade and a half of its existence, as much as it empowers the US dollar system and the private banks that control the Fed. So it's one of those awkward things where I think Bitcoiners have generally been correct about identifying Bitcoin as this new paradigm, because it is. It removes the ability for the state to debt pardon, to create capital. Now the new rate of growth in the economy, if this model does play out, is the issuance of Bitcoin, which has this disinflationary step function every 210,000 blocks, about every 4 years, the issuance cuts in half. And that's a state change to money. I mean, it changes the way, instead of you hold your money in dollars and every 4 years it devalues, 2% compounding every 4 years, that's incredibly significant. Now instead it actually theoretically does the opposite, where it grows every 4 years because the rate of relative issuance goes down. So it is a state change of money, which I think is generally very helpful for humans. This is a good thing. Unfortunately, it's surrounded by an open, transparent ledger. It's surrounded by, people, these vultures basically, that have used debt-based systems and surveillance to control humans. They're now surrounding it, and they have more resources to take advantage of the incoming deflationary world. So they're poised and ready basically to colonize Bitcoin, assuming that it's like real estate, it's this ledger. They're there to take more advantage of it than we can. So it's really important, I think, for Bitcoiners and just freedom advocates in general, people that are interested and understand that the fiat model is broken, that yes, the Bitcoin model is better innately economically in this kind of Austrian model, but it's also better for those same people. So how do we not manufacture consent for the Jamie Dimons and Larry Finks of the world to throw us all on this universal ledger and march into this panopticon excited how Larry Fink is pumping our bags? How do we prevent that from happening? We have to make sure Bitcoin doesn't just become an asset that's paperized and you trade it with shares on BlackRock's iShares IBIT ticker. And instead, we really focus on making it a currency that can be utilized by everyone in the world, and that billions of people can hold Bitcoin in a self-sovereign, self-custodial way, and it doesn't just become the settlement network for central banks around the world.
Right on. Anything else you want to add before we wrap?
I think that really covers it pretty much. Thanks so much for talking with me, Whitney.
Yeah, absolutely.